working with the UPC.
Hi, let's reconvene, please. So before we start with the public hearings portion, Mr. Strothman had a clarification to one of Commissioner Anderson's questions, so if you can do that, you can share that publicly as well as for people at home.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just pointing out on pages 109 to 111 in Chapter 4 of our specific plan address Commissioner Anderson's question, element of Commissioner Anderson's question about how parking would be accommodated in this case in residential areas that are proposed, and those standards are defined in the cross sections in pages 109 to 111 of Chapter 4 of the specific plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So with that in mind, a reminder for the guidelines of the public hearings. So as we said earlier, typically the Planning Commission's rules of procedure call for meetings to end at 10:30, and by a majority of the commissioners present, we can extend that time. And the Commission can also vote to continue the hearing to another night if we perceive that's necessary. And in terms of organization of the public comments, we have, thank you very much for filling out the speaker cards, and we have a general idea. We do want to clarify that this is a presentation, and the purpose of the presentation is to clarify and for us to get a better understanding, is not for public debate. And so we're not here to have anyone present their position or their comments or their critique of the presentation, simply so that we can understand and clarify. So please keep that in mind, because some of the speaker cards here indicate that there's 10 minutes or 5 to 10 minutes. So I'm guessing that means that you have a very long list of questions to ask the applicant. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there, and we'll try to clarify further. We will extend the speaker time if the speaker requests it and we deem it necessary. And also, if you've made a comment, we're going to ask that you reserve that remainder time for any additional follow-up questions to let those who have not had a chance to speak first. Okay? So as a courtesy, please adhere to the time limits. Questions and comments should be addressed to the Commission. Please speak directly into the mic. It's very difficult for people at home to hear you. If you have a question where you need one or more of the experts to speak up, if we can ask you to please sit down so that the experts can share the microphone, since we only have one microphone to use. And to please keep the comments to the topics under consideration for tonight's meeting. And if someone already has made a comment or if that you agree with, please, there's no need to repeat that. Just mention that you support that comment. And again, a reminder that this is for comprehension clarification. Deliberations will not happen at the earliest in January, as we mentioned earlier. So we will kind of gauge the amount of time that it appears that the public and the Commission needs to talk to the applicant and his or her experts. So at that point, we will reevaluate how to proceed. So don't worry, we will make sure that we accommodate everybody's questions. But please respect the guidelines that have been set here. With that in mind, we're going to start off with the speaker cards that indicate the least amount of time. So hopefully that will allow everyone to have an opportunity to speak and to not keep everyone here over time. So Mr. Prem Law.
Good evening, chairpersons and Universal Paragon folks. My name is Prem Law. I live here in Brisbane, a Brisbane resident, and I have essentially, my questions are on three interrelated areas. One of them is soil stability, the second is structural integrity, and the third is anticipated noise levels from construction. When I drive on Tunnel Road in the Baylands, the asphalt peaks and troughs because the soil seems to be continually shifting, and it shifts far more than, say, elsewhere in Brisbane, because it's not really, you're not on top of bedrock, you're driving on all kinds of, soil overlapping garbage. So the question is, how stable is that soil that you're planning to build upon? And in order to achieve the structural integrity for the buildings that are proposed, how deep into that soil will the supporting beams need to be driven, essentially? And that's the subject of pile driving. And the noise generated by pile driving is pretty horrendous. And we need to know how many years we're going to be hearing this pile driving, whether this is going to go on for 10 years, 15 years, considering that we have construction anticipated for that period of time, and what noise level is anticipated from that pile driving, specifically a decibel level, and whether there is any means of mitigating that noise. So those are the three topics: the soil, the structural integrity of the buildings, whether they will be able to maintain their structural integrity over, say, 20 years, or whether they will begin cracking and, essentially falling apart, and then the noise levels anticipated.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Todd Adair, civil engineer with BKF Engineers, and Tom Graff to answer those questions, and whatever is yet unanswered, I will attempt myself to answer.
Good evening. Todd Adair from BKF Engineers, civil engineers. As far as the structural integrity of the soil, the idea, building on landfills, we address this by trying to put a layer of soil, enough soil there to bridge any type of settlement that we might have. some preparation of the soil before we start construction, such as surcharging or trying to even out as much as we can the landfill that's there. And there will be some differentials, just the nature of development on landfill. But the idea is to try to prep it in such a way that it's mitigatable over time and repairable over time. Some of the conditions that you see on some of those roads today didn't take any of these type of mitigations into account. So you're getting sort of maximum settlement, differential settlement. We're going to try to bridge that through geotech preparation. As far as structural, I don't know if you can answer that, Tom, how far down we'd have to go.
As far as this, Tom Graff, as far as the structural goes for the buildings, is that because over the landfill area, it will likely be pile construction, and the piles would have to go through the landfill material, through the bay mud, into the ground underneath. The pile lengths will vary throughout the entire site because the depth of mud, the depth of garbage, the depth to solid bearing ground varies. The piles could be anywhere from 50 to 100 feet or 125 feet, depending upon where you are in the site. And it's very typical throughout the Bay Area that buildings are built on landfills and perform wonderfully and have been built there for many years. So that it's a standard technique that the geotech engineers do design on all the time. And I can't answer the decibel level. I think it's distance, but that's not it.
Yeah, I don't know the decibel levels, but usually there's mitigations or impacts and mitigations in the EIRs that talk about pile driving, ways of shrouding the equipment if possible, times of day, those type of things that mitigate those pile driving issues.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Beth Grossman?
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
So Prem asked my question also about the pile driving, and anyone who was here during the time of the Caltrain Bridge reparations can remember that the City Council had to give out earplugs, so they did no good for any of us, and we all went completely crazy, and it was a very limited period of time that we had to deal with that. So that is a very large concern, and as I was listening to the presentation, the question that just kept coming up for me is, what's in this whole plan for Brisbane? Because with the 25-year plan and all the things that we're going to be dealing with, the sound pollution, the traffic, the construction, that's the way that we get into the city is going along Tunnel Road, and the infrastructure costs that we would have to incur with the roads and the police, fires, and school, et cetera. What's really in it for us? And then when I heard that about phase 2 not happening till the end of 25 years from now, and the phase 2 would be the part that's been the carrot that's been held out for Brisbane, which would be the open space and all of that. Well, at 25 years, I'm 57. My chances of actually seeing that are pretty slim, and I will have endured all those years of pile driving and construction. So I think that that's what I'm just not clear about, in terms of what do we get out of this, other than that the developer gets to have a lot of profit from their development. So that's one question. And then the other thing I'm very concerned about too is the capping techniques and how that they are, like they tried to answer the questions about the trees, but how, if there's going to be housing, how are they going to control somebody who wants to plant a redwood tree in their backyard, which has happened in Brisbane, and they, or like other trees, we're not going to be able to control that kind of planting. And then I'm also concerned about the pile driving going through the capping and how they control that, and if there was earthquakes and the membranes were in some way ruptured, who's going to be responsible for fixing that? And then how we're going to account for sea rise with pending climate change. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will attempt to answer the first few questions, and then I would invite Mr. Munoz from Biohabitats to address the last one on sea level rise. Ms. Grossman mentioned excellent question. What do we get? And perhaps there's a misperception about when parks would come online. Again, there is not a proposal that somehow we start by building housing and then 25 years later there would be open space built. I'm not certain where that misperception came from, and so to answer Ms. Grossman's question, there's a rule in larger developments like this that's applied by many municipalities around the country, called loosely the rule of proportionality and proximity. And what that essentially means is that in the phasing approvals of larger projects, that a proportional amount of the public benefits, like parks, are to be included at delivery at the same or approximately the same time as certain, in this case, income-producing improvements. So that rule is very very widely applied, and I expect in a development agreement between the city of Brisbane and us that something like that would happen, and that would include development of parks immediately concurrent with initial phases. As to the really important concerns about tree planting in backyards and the repairs of potential breaks in the liners and things like that. Let me first say, from the standpoint of tree planting, this would be highly controlled by both the regulations of the state, either the Water Board or the DTSC, that oversee and set the standards for monitoring of these sites, and those rules would carry over into either the ownership associations for businesses or for homeowners to have very strict guidelines about what can and can't be planted. This is not an area where any residential development would contemplate private backyards. It's just not appropriate in this site. Even the low-density area of townhome development would have commonly planted landscapes with small private areas that are adjacent to each building. So a lot of these concerns are regulated and would be addressed at the project level. I wonder if Mr. Munoz can take a few minutes to address the sea level rise question through the lens of some of the transitional wetlands work that he's looking at.
Thanks. Pete Munoz, Senior Engineer with Biohabitats. In terms of being resilient for sea level rise and climate change, we know that one of the biggest things the Bay Area is at risk of is dealing with tidal surges. And so the two main interfaces that the property has with tidal surge is any restoration of the creek in the middle of the development, or in the lagoon. And really, both of those spaces is being restored green infrastructure and restored green infrastructure both for creating open space, but having that open space double as open area that can absorb tidal surges. Specifically on the northern edge of the lagoon, one of the most amazing opportunities for this area is the increase of transitional zone tidal habitat that's something that the entire Bay Area has been looking at and increasingly trying to find opportunities for transitional zone habitat to enhance. The North Shore of the lagoon is actually a really good candidate for restoring that, and that's one of the opportunities we've been looking at.
All right, thank you.
Did anyone have an answer for the question about how the cap is repaired if it's damaged?
I believe I can ask Tom Graff or Nancy Bice to answer that, but I believe it's covered in my answer as to the regulatory oversight and monitoring that it would be required on an annual basis by the Water Board and or the DTSC. They would be monitoring for those types of breaches and have contingencies for addressing them.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Brian Galusha?
Hello, Commissioners. I'm Brian Galusha. I'm a Brisbane resident as well as a Brisbane small business owner. And so I've been a tenant of the Industrial Way for the last 2 years. And so we've had issues getting things fixed on that property. And so we're really focused on, I think, second, the concern about the caps and how, if they're broken, how they're fixed. And also if they're in a worst case scenario, basically if there's health issues, if residents or owners of the commercial land had any health issues related to that, who's responsible for that, and how that would get resolved. The second question is light pollution. Just address, it's Brisbane, it's the city of stars. The dark night sky is an important attribute of the city, and just how that is maintained or how that's affected by the development. And then lastly is from a business perspective of how this will benefit directly small Brisbane-based businesses. And that's it.
Thank you.
From back to front to Mr. DeLucia's questions in terms of impact or opportunity for small businesses in Brisbane. There are over the course of the development period, the various types of development that are proposed out here, whether it be in business incubation for technology or biotech. I believe Mr. DeLucia's business is in the kind of combination of robotics and technology, as I understand it. Would have opportunities in some of those incubators, smaller footprint areas along Bayshore, much like where the industrial warehouses are today. Regarding light pollution, this is an area that is studied very closely in the EIR, and I'm really not familiar enough with the specifics of those studies right here, but I would refer to those studies, and will just say in general that most of the requirements that are responsive to the potential for light pollution for sites like this require downcast lighting that focuses the light very specifically on where it's needed, on streets and open space areas, and has very keen restrictions about keeping those downcast. And so I know that's something that was addressed in the EIR, or I believe it was. I would ask Nancy Bice to address responsibility for health issues regarding health and safety of workers and occupants, if you would.
I'm Nancy Bice. Obviously, all of the remediation and any engineering controls that are used that include things like caps would be designed to prevent any exposure to anyone or any ecological receptor. So we don't anticipate anyone being affected by the residual materials at this site. If someone were, obviously there would be an evaluation to determine whether or not it was truly related to the residual materials. And if it was, then they would be cleaned up, and whatever that person would need to be made whole. But as I said, all of these systems are designed to prevent any exposure.
So in your previous examples that was provided by you and Tom, you have never run across any of these issues?
Never. Never had anyone be sick or be affected by the chemicals. That's the whole point, is to prevent those exposures.
And the oldest example, there was a site that was as old as 11 years old.
Right. That in my history there.
Sorry, please don't. Yeah.
In my history, the site in Palo Alto we started construction in 2006. I think it was done in 2008. So that's 8 years.
Okay, 7 years then. Okay.
Yeah. And we can get you some examples of older sites that I just don't have at the top of my head.
I remember you're saying Campus for Jewish Life was 11 years and functioning well. Is that not correct?
That's 8 years.
Oh, that was 8 years.
Campus
okay,
for Jewish Life.
Thank you.
Can I have a follow-up question on that? Any of these sites encounter a major earthquake that you're aware of? Like Palo Alto, you said 7 years, but we never had any major earthquake during this time. The concern is in case of an earthquake, and since it is a fill material, you have a great chance of liquefaction, and as a result, the top layer could easily split. So you don't have that experience so far with 7 years in Palo Alto. Are you aware of any other state or any other areas where you had that kind of a situation?
I'm not personally aware of sites that have undergone significant earthquakes, obviously small earthquakes, but this development would be designed to withstand any of those. Certainly when liquefaction would not be acceptable in any part of the development, because then structures are...
You can't help it, the liquefaction at this site, unless you remove the entire material, because the thing is, it's a very high water table here, and the type of soil. So I think the soils engineer will probably agree with me that there is a great potential of liquefaction here, and also the differential settlement. In case of a structure, you can put the piles up to the bedrock, but the rest of the structures, roads and all that, they will experience a differential settlement unless you remove the material, do the CBR testing to put engineered fill. That's the only way to prevent that.
And I would just add too that we would need a plan to address those things, right? We would need to get in there quickly and clean up anything after an earthquake.
This is to address the liquefaction issue again. Is there's two things. Is in any liquefaction area, you have a layer of clean soil over the top, and soil can adjust. So, for example, DTSC and the Water Board, when they have deed restrictions, so if you have contaminated material underneath, inspections are required every year and after any significant earthquake. So first of all, there's an immediate inspection of the site after an earthquake required in any deed restriction. And so if there were breaches in the ground, which is very, very rare in a liquefaction, typically when you get liquefied areas, you'll get the area dropping, and you'll get a movement because you have a whole layer of soil on top that's not liquefying because it's above the water table. So you don't get breaches in the ground of 2 or 3 feet dropping. you get
depending on the material underneath.
you don't get
that's
that.
yeah.
And so
because each material will be different. So.
well, the whole point though is that you have layers of clean fill, you have geotextiles underneath it, you typically get differential type settlements, and that it is inspected. It's required to be inspected after by the deed restriction after any earthquake. So if any potential exposures would be known and would be fixed at that point in time.
Yeah, I shouldn't have jumped into that because this is a public comment. I've been reminded. So sorry about that.
I think the question also was asked, who would be taking care or be providing that, as you were saying, made whole? And I don't think that was addressed.
Made whole.
My understanding is that as part of a remedial action plan certification with the regulatory agencies, that essentially certify that the remediation of the area has been the active remediation of an area has been completed to the standards set by those agencies. They along with the deed restrictions that get set for the use of the land in the future, along with the monitoring plan that occurs, there's a financing mechanism that needs to be part of that remedial action plan certification. And we just went through this with the DTSC on the former Schlegel Lock site. There was an operation and maintenance plan and an operation and maintenance agreement and a financing mechanism for addressing those issues that was put in place consistent with the requirements of the regulatory agency.
Thank you. Okay. Ms. Deb Haru?
Hello, thank you, commissioners. My name's Deb Horn. I live in Brisbane. And I'm going to go back to the question that was just asked because I think we're not getting the answers, all the answers that we want. And this is around the idea of capping. I have some concerns that if trees can't be planted, if they need to be regulated so their roots won't go down deeper, and it's not safe for trees, how can it be safe for people to live there? So again, I want to talk about the capping and our water table here because I know people that live in the center of town. It's a flood zone, just like the park is a flood zone, and there's low areas in Brisbane that the water table actually comes right up to the houses into the basements. And of course, my concern is, wow, all this toxic area, all this leachate, right, is coming into the town of Brisbane. And with sea rise and with floods and more storms from climate change, I'm concerned about this additional land out there having a high water table. I'm not really understanding how the capping, how that fixes the fact that the water can rise and come up to where people live or in their basements. I'm just going to try and get through my questions and concerns. And so the question that was just asked about how do we make them whole, and we just heard that there's a financing mechanism. I just would like to know who pays for that. Is that Brisbane pays for that? Or is money set aside by the developer? So again, those questions are really about the capping, sea rise, those things. I have concerns also about transportation. I worked for the city and county of San Francisco for 16 years for the PUC and for San Francisco Muni, and was involved with a lot of transit planning. And they have spoken of, there's a lot of studies looking at regional transit that identify and make suggestions. I will tell you it takes years and decades to coordinate transportation. And it's not just identifying funding sources, demand, it's the coordination between regional transit properties that really have no motivation to support areas that are not in their purview. So that goes through the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And again, I'd like to hear in the plan, what is the plan for the transit plan? Not just what has been studied, what is suggested, funding sources that have been identified that can evaporate. What is the transit plan for public transit? Again, for transportation, there's going to be new housing all around the Baylands, Daly City, Schlegg Lock, all of those housing developments, up to 30,000 new housing. So what about roads? What about thoroughfares? Where's the plan? Who's going to pay for that? Access to freeways. So even if we don't build housing, we're going to have all of that need in front of us. So I want to know, what is the plan there? And my last concerns and statement are about sustainability, and I understand how technology is changing, and there needs to be some flexibility for technology. But the other thing that's changing is climate change. It's accelerating. It's, I think, one of the largest concerns that we should have here, and any municipality should have, is how are we going to respond to climate change? And so I think our sustainability model is even going to be flexible as we have more storms, as we have more sea rise and more issues because of climate. And so I think, net zero has got to be, not the highest bar that we're trying to reach, but it's got to be the lowest bar. And the highest bar really needs to be carbon offset, renewables, whether that's wind, solar, carbon capture. There's innovations that are happening now and will be happening in the next 20 years. And if we really want to be greener than New York City, we'll be more innovative about what sustainability means as far as some of the things that may be possible with carbon capture, scrubbing, electric cars, charging stations, solar, renewables, all of those things. So, anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will do my best to answer what questions I can. The last question seemed to be a little more about setting the question how to respond to climate change, and setting net zero as the low bar. What we're very excited about, and we think there's a great opportunity for on this site, is not just in the application of technology for the project, but in being a center for innovation that is going to disrupt this area and apply those same creative forces that have really broken through in other technologies in the green technology fields. We believe that above and beyond the standards that are set for development on the site, that if Brisbane and we and our partners do this right, that we really will have a great research and development facility that will be leading the innovation of green technologies. And so look forward to working on that. In terms of the question about what is the transit plan for the region, in terms of public transportation improvements, what is the plan for improvements of roads and thoroughfares. There are multi-year processes for these. I agree with the speaker. In both cases, starting about 10 years ago, these processes were initiated by the City of Brisbane. The project study report for the Geneva extension and the Geneva interchange was initiated by the City of Brisbane in 2006, I believe. And the project study report was the initial of many phases that Caltrans needs to go through to identify regional improvements to such major thoroughfares. When at a later stage, once there's some decisions made from Brisbane about what the future development of this site would be, it would go to a project reporting phase, which is much more specific engineering for those interchange and street improvement facilities. And then, of course, during that project reporting phase, they'd be going into the priority pipeline in terms of identifying funding for getting it built. Yes, it's multi-generational, but it's started 10 years ago. And the same happened with the bi-county study, also initiated, I believe, in 2006. And this is just how transportation planning happens. This is the city would set conditions of approval for developers on the Baylands to do improvements to local streets, again proportionate to the impact of those developments around it. But when it comes to these larger regional improvements that are much beyond the Baylands site, those processes are underway and ongoing. There was a question about clarification about the financing mechanism for mitigation. For monitoring and mitigation for the regulatory agencies. This is a financial guarantee that the developer or the owner of the site needs to provide. So it's actually a financial guarantee that the monitoring will be funded for a period of time that's determined by the regulatory agency. So that is set again in that remedial action plan completion process. There has to be guarantee of payment by the private entity responsible for the cleanup and for the monitoring. I'm going to ask Mr. Graff and or Mr. Adair to come up and address the water table concerns and the capping concerns. The comment was if it's not safe for trees, why people on capping side? And then I think just some clarifications about how the water table works and how that might impact development here.
This is Tom Graff. I'd like to start with a clarification on the trees. Is what I had mentioned again is the trees. It's not unhealthy for the trees, for the roots to go down into the soil. It just is when you put a cap. Most of the time, you put a geotextile over the top of the contaminated material, so the tree roots can't get through it. So what you want to do is, in order to be able to allow the trees to be healthy, you would extend the depth so that it allows the tree to flourish. It's not that it's unhealthy for the tree, for the roots to go into the soil. So that was just one clarification. As far as, again, the capping and the water table, I'd like to, is from the civil engineering standpoint, we could do it, or maybe Nancy Weiss is a hydro talking about the water level and ability to change.
I think it might be premature to get into too much of the details about this because what will happen for the project is there will be a remedial action plan that will take all of these issues into account. And there will be more studies to look at whether or not there are chemicals in the zone that could be affected by the water table going up and down. And the remedial action plan will need to address those exposures. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that it's not completely written in stone yet exactly how that's going to work, because there are more studies to be done, and we need to know more about those interactions. I don't know if that addresses the question. I don't know what else to add.
The comment that I heard was water from the baylands coming into the town. The groundwater gradient on the site is towards the bay, towards the lagoon and towards the bay. So water from the bayland site does not go to the town of Brisbane. Yes, there are low water levels, there's flood areas, but the groundwater is flowing, again, towards the bay, towards the lagoon. So what Nancy had talked about, again, is when we look at fluctuations in water level, it's going to be a design on what's necessary from the landfill standpoint, from leachate generation, from all that, but that's part of the design that's required by the agencies. But what is on what is in the baylands doesn't go towards Brisbane. It goes towards the bay, and that's being monitored with monitoring wells that are currently in place.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't understand that part of the question. The groundwater flow direction is from the city of Brisbane toward the lagoon and toward San Francisco Bay. And we have probably 6 feet of head difference between those two. And, it would take obviously 6 feet of sea level rise for that to ever become an issue. So I don't see that being an issue really in the next 100 years.
Okay. Justin Guzman?
Do we need to extend the meeting or we don't?
Yeah, let's finish this question.
How many cards do we have?
I think there's
Just
two. Good evening, everybody. My name is Justin Guzman, resident small business owner of Brisbane. I'm glad I actually waited last because I've had some other concern arise as I've heard these questions. Some of my questions are for information availability for the residents of Brisbane, and I wanted to stay on topic with the caps and ecology questions. So in the presentation, I did see the mention of controlling waterways and doing that above 20 to 30 foot caps. What studies have been done, or prolonged studies have been done on the effects of the ecology as far as organisms in the water, things like that, if you plan to have any wildlife in the water, or just information as far as that goes? As well as I moved here from San Francisco, born and raised. I've heard a lot of talk about what's going on in Hunters Point and their toxic land, I'll just leave it at that, and cancer-causing effects on the residents. And it's come up numerous times on the ballots over there, and it's been batted down for debatable reasons. But knowing residents and speaking with families, it's real hard to turn down people who claim that they've experienced this themselves when they're in your face, and you go to a corporate person, and the corporate person just starts spouting out numbers and things like that. So is there any more information as far as local projects that mirror this project, and as they were concerned with, any longer than 7-11 years? And if there is, can we have it compiled and made readily available to us as residents? Because I think this stuff gets away from us. I think we ask a convoluted question, we get a convoluted answer. I think this is my first meeting, but I get the impression that we're going to come back next week and forget half of it. and half of it won't have to be addressed again because there's so much to these questions. So is there a site, a handout, or anything like that that you can comprise to give to residents so we can inform ourselves and not have to rely on the experts? We can be experts ourselves, as we should be, to make decisions in this matter. Can we have it handed out here? Can we have it handed out at the Baylands office? And the last, I think I missed a couple, and that's fine, but my last concern would be, as I look at these maps, and I may be an idiot, but I've lived in San Francisco my whole life and here for 5-6 years. I think it would be very helpful, at least for myself, speaking for myself, to be able to see an aerial shot of the proposed area, north, south, east, and west, sitting side by side with the projected plans on one sheet, so that somebody can look at this and stay abreast of exactly what you're talking about, and if there's any changes to come, just to stay abreast, and again, not put the reliance on experts and all these concerns, and become experts ourselves a little bit more. And if we can have the help of the Baylands and of our community to help us get this information. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It came up before Mr. Guzman's comments about wanting case studies, if you will, of some of these local project references where some of these items have been addressed. I know that the regulatory agencies have some information that we can draw from in putting those together, and I would we certainly would put those together for both availability at our project information office on Visitation Avenue, but also for submittal for staff if it were useful. And same on there. We actually would invite Mr. Guzman or anyone who's interested in looking at some of those comparative aerial shots to the proposed development to come visit us at our project information office. We do have some of those, and some of those images are embedded in the materials of both the specific plan, but also out in the office. So we'd be happy to provide those.
I hate to interrupt because this is for the public, but what times are you open at the office?
Those
I mean, if he wants to visit, do you have at the door when you're open?
Yeah, we're open several days a week, and those hours have fluctuated a little bit based on demand. But is our office? I'm going to introduce Xiomara Cisneros, who staffs our office, and she can tell you those times.
Xiomara Cisneros, Community Outreach Manager, and the office hours are Tuesdays, 9 a.m. till 1 p.m., Thursdays, 1 p.m. till 5, and Saturdays is a newer hour, just switched 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. So.
Can you come up to the mic, please?
I have been to the Baylands office, and it is a very helpful place to go to if you're looking for information. These are great people, honestly. But when you're speaking about this, and we're all here at the same time and trying to stay on the same page, can we have it more readily available? Maybe a handout here or something like that, so that when you're pointing at the map and we're going on different topics, that we just know. Because I've heard Geneva referenced 5 times, and I thought I was standing in 10 different places on Geneva, and obviously I wasn't right any time I was imagining myself there. So that's just kind of where the concern came from.
So perhaps if you can provide it to the staff, that will be part of the record.
Yes, we'll do that, and we'll pull that from a combination of documents that I believe are already part of the public record. Thanks for that clarification. A couple of other questions that Mr. Guzman asked were about wildlife, the waterways, and the interface of wildlife and biological organisms in water. I would ask Mr. Munoz to answer that based on some daylighting of dead creeks that Biohabitats has done in other cities. and then perhaps ask Mr. Graff or Ms. Bice to address the question of Hunters Point and the environmental conditions out there. I know also that Mr. Adair's civil engineering company has done a lot of civil engineering work out there at Hunters Point. Mr. Munoz?
Sorry, as a point of order, at this point it's 10:30. Oh, please step forward. We're going to need to either decide to make a motion to extend or move on to possibly another meeting. So we have 2 cars remaining. Each says 10 minutes each. That would be at least 20 minutes more.
Well, let's extend until 11, I guess.
Could you speak into the mic?
So let's extend until 11.
Is that okay with other commissioners?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I need a motion.
Yes.
Make a motion to extend this meeting until 11 o'clock, 11 p.m.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Sure. Just to answer the question about waterways and the ecology, and again, the 2 major water bodies being the lagoon to the south of the property and the creek that flows west-east in the middle of the property. One thing that has really transformed the Bay Area in the last 10 to 20 years is the amount of restoration that's happening both on the Bay side, but also the waterways, both urban and rural, that feed the Bay, and the scientific understanding of those and the needs for increased ecological function in both Bay tidal areas as well as riparian tidal areas. So that science is increasing every year. This last year, there was a huge push to really understand, as I mentioned earlier, the transition zone, a tidal influence around the bay, and the importance that has in the local ecology, both for restoring ecological function, but also becoming resilient to climate surges, or climate change and tidal surges. So that science is improving. There are a ton of areas, both in the Bay Lagoon area as well as riparian tidal influence areas just around the area that we can draw from for the opportunities on the Bayland site.
And, there was one last question that was asked about comparing this site to Hunters Point and some of the cancer-causing agents that I believe were alleged to have occurred out there.
Unfortunately, I'm not personally familiar with what's happening at Hunters Point, but I do know that they have a different suite of chemicals. I think there are often effects of people, having not been protected in that area for many, many, many years. I'm very confident that the regulators that we work with and the professional engineers and geologists who are obligated to protect the people of California do their best to clean up these sites to protect people. Like I said, I don't know the specifics, but I do know that for this site, we know a lot about what's out there. We know a lot about how to protect people from it. We still have some work to do to figure out the details of that, but I'm confident that it can be done here.
So, sorry, can I just follow up on that? So with that in mind, you will be providing further case studies, as was questioned before. Would you be providing it to the staff?
Yeah, we'll work with UPC to get whatever we can on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Barbara Ebo.
So I have a number of questions, and I'm just going to start working through these. I'm sorry if they're not in the most rational order. My name is Barbara Ebel. In the DEIR, it claims that the buildings will be oriented for passive solar, for wind, and to minimize sound intrusion from Caltrain. And I'm wondering how that's going to work. I would like the design people to maybe explain a little bit about how they're going to accomplish all three of those goals simultaneously, because I think those are all important, because the minimizing sound intrusion, that's a mitigation measure for Caltrain. Minimizing the wind resistance, that's a mitigation for the windsurfers. Passive solar, well, that's something we're interested in terms of achieving net zero. So I just want an explanation about how we're going to achieve all three of those, because it seems like a really tricky thing to be able to orient a building for three different things. Thank you. That's my first question.
So it's a really good question. And in addition to that, the buildings are trying to capture views, and sometimes these objectives are in direct opposition with each other. So it's a tricky business. Every site is also different, and the orientation of sites are different. I think that's where the design challenges really lie. And
sorry, could you actually speak into the phone?
And that's where the
people at home can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. And that's where the creative process comes in. So I think John can talk about this a little bit too in terms of the architectural portion. But it starts with the site planning. The site shapes can vary. The orientation of the buildings on the sites can vary, and every site's different. It's a complicated question because there's not one size that fits all for every site. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Hi, I'm John Ellis. I'm an architect with Methuen-Solomon in San Francisco. This is a very good question because designing buildings in a complicated situation like this requires a lot of attention to detail in terms of both site planning as well as building orientation. We've done a number of buildings in San Francisco that address these issues. For example, we've just finished a building in Mission Bay, which is an extremely windy part of the site. It's right on 4th Street. We designed the building with baffles in order to address the wind issues. We addressed the solar issues in terms of shading devices added to the outside of the building. We had solar panels up on the roof which were oriented due south in order to get maximum sun exposure. So it's a combination of both site planning and building design, and it is a complicated issue, but it certainly can be addressed very satisfactorily. I hope that answers your question.
I understand this is probably the best answer I can get right now, but it does not address my penultimate concern, which is these are listed as mitigation measures. So unless you're going to put the buildings on Lazy Susans, I don't know how those are viable mitigation measures. I'm very, it's wonderful to hear that UPC is considering to spend millions on parks, but I didn't hear us. When the question was asked about money set aside for transportation, I didn't hear an answer to that. And I'm particularly concerned because with UPC and Caltrain and Samtrans, if they're demand-driven, then these extra vehicles, these extra trips probably won't be in place until towards the end of the project, 25 years from now. In the meantime, we've got a lot of extra traffic going on. And then I was also concerned about how the financing for things like the internal shuttles, because that's not going to be picked up by Caltrains, Muni, Samtrans, or any of these other, they're not interested in these small lines. So I was curious how the internal shuttle would be paid for. And also, if there's any way that we can get these transit services in place prior to the 25-year build-out.
On the question of internal shuttles, we operate with three office buildings and 2 residential projects over at Executive Park. The owners association for those few buildings funds a shuttle system that takes residents and workers to the Caltrain station and to the BART station. And so I would expect that part of the conditions of approvals for individual projects within the initial phases of the Bayland development would include that required provision. As I mentioned before, the Transportation Demand Management Plan outlines some of those features, and it would be up to the city to define the proportionate mitigation for the phase development that is proposed at that time. In terms of the question of money set aside for the larger transportation improvements, as I mentioned before, it would be the developer's expectation that they would be made responsible as a condition of approval for a phase of development for providing funding for the streets that would be adjacent to that development to serve that portion of the development, and that in terms of financing mechanisms, set-asides, if you will, toward future improvements for the regional transportation, that there are many ways that are dealt with. I would suggest that becomes an issue of consideration again for conditions of approval. In San Francisco, they are just about to change individual mitigation measures for individual projects. In other words, the requirements to do street improvements or new light new traffic signals and the like, with an actual fee that is just calculated to feed into capital improvement programs that are planned over time. And I imagine San Mateo County is considering some of those funding mechanisms as well. As I mentioned earlier, the bi-county study is only the beginning of looking at that countywide, but I hope that answers both the questions. That's the best I can at this point.
There's also been an ongoing community concern about how tall this project's going to be in the end. And yes, we know we've got X number of buildings, but we don't really know exactly how much fill we have where and how tall the buildings are going to be on top of that. So, I mean, they were mentioning 20 to 30 feet of fill, and then if you have these high-rise buildings on top of that, at some point, and I'm wondering if they can address this now, we need to know how tall the net is between the fill, from sea level rise. If you got 20 feet of fill and another 50, 75 feet of building, this is getting a little massive. So I'm wondering if they can speak to that somewhat at this time.
Thank you. Just as the clarification from before, the height of buildings would not necessarily be starting in every location on top of 20 to 30 feet of fill. What was mentioned earlier was that there would be up to 25 feet of fill right on the edge of the Geneva Bridge that would go over the Caltrain tracks. And at that point, as Mr. Stickley has outlined in the specific plan, a couple of stories of development would happen below grade there. But if you can address, Jim, the maximum building heights that are all outlined in the specific plan and how those heights are judged at permitting, I think that would be important.
Just to back up a little bit, this is another really good question and very complicated. First of all, there's the shape of the ground plane and so the shape of the ground plane has actually been designed and determined in a grading plan, and that's part of the infrastructure plan that Todd Adair and his team have done. It's not the final technical grading plan that's going to be used on a project-by-project basis, but it's quite detailed, and to establish conceptually how these different areas of the east side as well as the west side step from one block to the next, how streets are sloped, between those blocks, how we transition from areas that have lots of fill to areas that have little fill, how we step up to the Geneva crossing, as Jonathan mentioned. All of that has been integrated into this grading plan. So that information is there, and it's pretty detailed. On top of that, then, as the speaker mentioned, there are the different building heights, and we have to look at allowable heights, which the entire project is not going to the allowable heights, because if you took every building parcel to its allowable height, we would exceed the overall development cap. So the allowable heights, will vary, but in general, the taller buildings are allowed in the northern portions of the site near Geneva. All of that has been modeled in a 3D model, and we actually provided information to the EIR team, because they were looking at the visual impacts. They needed to model that, so we cooperated with them and were able to give them some of our building modeling and as well as the 3D topo model, and those things were put together. So that information does exist. It's part of the EIR analysis. Beyond that, it would be, it would start to get very complicated if I tried to refer to, any specific parcel. But the information is there, and it's available, and it's been looked at very carefully in the EIR.
Can I ask a very quick question?
If I may, just to clarify with something specific to Ms. Ebel's question, the tallest buildings or the tallest allowable heights in the DSP are on right adjacent to the intersection of Geneva Avenue and the Caltrain tracks are 125 feet. Mm-hmm. So to be specific,
correct.
That's the maximum. That was the maximum. That was the maximum height, 125 feet. That was suggested.
Yeah, and those tend to be at points. There aren't extended lengths or even whole blocks that would be allowed at that height. They would tend to be a small volume right at the corner of a parcel as a part of an allowance for a gateway statement. But the general height of the buildings in that block would actually be much lower. They would be, more like 7 stories or 80 to 90 feet. So the 125 that Jonathan mentioned are, specific points.
May I ask a very quick question? The height of the building, how do you calculate that? Is it from the top of the fill, or the existing ground?
From the top of the fill.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
it's
if
from the
fill is-
ground level, from the street level.
So if the fill is 25 feet high, then on top of that another 7 stories.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So will be pretty high.
And could you tell me, you mentioned that the grading plan was already available. Is that Appendix F, or which part of the specific plan and infrastructure plan could that be found in?
You might want to.
You can tell me after the meeting.
Yeah. Well, there's.
Chapter 4 of the infrastructure plan contains the grading plan, and this is in the public record, but I do have a hard copy of that here, just as a reference.
Okay, thank you. Chapter 4.
And that's the infrastructure plan, is not the specific plan.
Right.
I just have one final concern about that, and that is, I know when they modeled the buildings for the wind tunnel and the windsurfers, they modeled those buildings and blocks as uniform, and here we're hearing that they are not going to be these uniform blocks, and so obviously that's going to have some bearing on the wind modeling, because the more surface articulation you have, the more it's going to disrupt the wind. So we have two things now that are in conflict. Also, there was my friend here, her point was not about surface water. We understand that surface water can be controlled through storm drains and slope. The concern that this community has, I think, with sea level rise has more to do with subsurface water and the fact that that landfill was not an engineered landfill, so that there is no barrier on the lower side of it, and as sea level rises, there's a real rational concern about marine water inundation, and then that being driven by hydrostatic pressure from the bay towards Brisbane, even towards the OU1, right, where the rail yard is. So, of it just that leachate migrating west. And I'm wondering if they can, I don't see there being any response to this. I think it's an unanswerable question, but I'd like to hear what they say.
I would like to defer to an engineer to answer this question, and that would not be me.
So we have groundwater maps available that show the contours of the groundwater and the elevations of the groundwater and where it flows. And I think if you see those, you'll see there's a trough in the groundwater, so a low that runs along the west side. It's west of the landfill and west of Bayshore. And it basically acts as a barrier. So any water that comes out of the landfill, now the landfill's going to have a leachate collection system, so there shouldn't be any leachate coming out of the landfill at all. But it would basically flow to these low areas and then flow out toward the bay.
Did you answer the question about hydrostatic pressure coming from the bay? Groundwater up. That's what she asked.
If there's a sea level rise, you mean?
The question was that in the case of there being marine water pressure or hydrostatic pressure pushing leachate from underneath, is that something that you can address?
Well, it's actually the opposite. There's a mound of water under the landfill from surface water infiltration. So, if anything, that water is depressing the water beneath the landfill and would push water out toward the bay.
I have one request of the Planning Commission, and that is if we are looking for a history of buildings built on landfill, that we're looking for buildings that are at least 20 years old, that went through the 89, that have had a generation. I mean, we should be looking at least that far out, because we expect these buildings to be there 100 years. We should be able to look at some buildings with at least a 20-year track record. At least for me, that's the kind of data and history I would be looking for, and I think it's a good idea. Couple of other things here. UPC's plan is not net zero. That word has been thrown around a couple of times, and I just want to be clear that that the plan does not meet that goal at this time. I hope that UPC will consider revising that. The community proposed plan was also referred to as the community preferred plan. It is not the community preferred plan. And I'm also wondering, it's a big deal to propose a plan that is not consistent with the general plan. And I'm wondering if the applicant has anything they'd like to say about why they chose to do that.
Our specific plan, Chapter 4 specifically, addresses a response to the questions surrounding the general plan. To answer Ms. Ebel's question, we and other developers around the country make proposals on a regular basis on legacy sites that have potential for an evolutionary use that builds off of its history, that require general plan amendments. It's very, very common. I have done it before in my career several times, including just on sites adjacent to this. We have a general plan amendment that in San Francisco that accommodated the development at the Schlegel Lock site with the environmental conditions that have been described. Same over at Executive Park. We have made this request because the general plan has not been changed in 20 years, and we believe that the general plan these are living documents that are responsive to evolving conditions in cities and of regions, and we are asking for consideration of general plan amendments to accommodate this plan, because we believe that that would help meet a lot of the objectives that have been set forth in the plan, and that's why we've asked for it. It is not uncommon. It may be of particular concern to some, but it is not uncommon. It's done quite regularly.
So as a point of order, thank you. So as a point of order, it is now 11 o'clock and we still have one speaker card for 10 minutes. In addition to that, we have the consent calendar and items initiated by staff, oral communications, and so on. So what is the commission?
I think we may have to continue in the next meeting, because after 11 o'clock, there are a lot of people at home complain, and they have complained vigorously about the city council meetings going up to 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, and at that point when everybody is tired, so I think the 11 o'clock should be a max in my opinion. I don't know what the other planning commissioners think about it.
Commissioner
But,
Parker?
that's going too far.
I thought that Barbara Ebel was the last person you.
No, we had two. We had
We
two
had
for a
two?
total of 20 minutes, but Barbara's questions ended up being 20.
Yeah, we have a lot of experts here tonight, though, and if we can really get through one more card and postpone just the other items, it might be worth.
We could do that, but the thing is, other items will take time also. And
Well, I mean, can we just cut it off after public commentary and not do our? I mean, we at least have to have an adjournment to another meeting, but.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that's an option.
Move that.
So
we could do that as long as there are not another 1 hour, 12 o'clock.
So how do the other commissioners feel?
Okay, I'll make a motion to continue until 11:30.
Is that okay, Commissioner Parker?
Yeah.
Commissioner Reinhardt?
Yeah, I agree. Yes.
Okay. So can you make a motion?
I did.
I'll second Jamil's motion.
Sorry, I was in the middle of speaking, so it wasn't actually complete. So can we actually officially make the motion now that we're done
I will
with the
officially make the
discussion?
motion to continue until 11:30.
Okay, 11:30?
I will officially second.
Thank you, and we will officially approve that. So, Mr. Ball?
All in favor, it's aye.
Yes.
Aye.
Aye. So, Paul Bushkel?
I extended it because I didn't want Paul to come back again.
Yeah, thanks. Paul Buscal, Brisbane resident. I was expecting all the commissioners to respond tonight, and I was curious as to why the vice chair and the chair had no comments. If you want to share that with us next meeting or after I'm done with my...
Okay, so that's one of your questions?
That's one of my questions.
Okay.
I was going to make comments about the general plan, which is 11 years past its review date of 2004. So, we're not in compliance ourselves as far as the city goes for not updating their general plan. I know that back in '94 when we worked on the general plan, there was a lot of concern about toxins in the baylands, and those concerns are still here today. And the unregulated dump, which who knows what's in there, yes, it's true that's going to be capped with so much soil on top of it that no trees are going to impact its barrier. With the railroad site being looked at for housing, I believe that this community wouldn't support housing in the baylands knowing that there were still toxins in there. I know that there are known toxins, bunker sea oil, lead, asbestos, and VOCs. And I would think that a thorough cleanup, we talk about the regulatory agencies, they only set minimums. There's also standards that we could accept that are maximum standards. And I'm not sure how much soil is going to be brought from the landfill site over to the railroad site to accommodate, I believe, sea level rise issues. They want to get the whole area raised, and also for the grade separation for Geneva. But if we're going to be bringing, I'm sure, millions of cubic yards over, why couldn't we take the contaminants? Well, I know one of the mitigated measures for like lead and asbestos is to put it under areas that are never going to be used for anything. Like probably that grade going up for Geneva would be a good spot to put it, where there's never going to be anything contacting that soil, utility corridors, plants, or anything, just roadway. With that said, could it be possible to take contaminants from the railroad site and areas where you're taking the soil from the landfill, not from the landfill, but the soil that's been stacked there, anticipating bringing it over to the other side, and taking those contaminants and putting it in a hole on top of the unregulated landfill and get rid of it? I mean, rather than taking it off site, it's still on site, but it's in the old landfill, and we make that railroad site clean. Then it's possible that some type of development, which could include housing, could possibly be acceptable to this community. While I'm not endorsing housing in the Baylands because it's going to be a community vote, I do think that that could be a possibility. You know, I talked about floating structures in the Baylands on the railroad site where they were going to enhance the corridor and daylight the creek. And back when I talked about it, there was no interest in it. And before I talked about it, I contacted the BCDC, who controls those types of waters and 100 feet on either side. And I thought, why don't we widen the channel, build floating structures? You know, I have friends, Anka and Sonder in Holland. There's a company called Delta Sync, SYNC, that builds floating structures and all the utilities for it. They'd be sea level rise adaptable. They'd be earthquake proof. No issues with liquefaction. Not thousands of pilings for conventional buildings. And when I checked with the BCDC about it, Will Travis at the time was the director for the BCDC, listened to me, and then said, okay, I got to stop you right there. Anything you put on bay waters, even if it's floating, is considered fill. Okay, once I was told that that wasn't possible, I said, how about this? How about we go next to the channel, dig out this area, i.e. clean it up, the contaminants, and build the floating structures, and then like they do in the salt ponds with the largest restoration on the West Coast down in our salt ponds, breach the levee and let that become tidal, anticipating sea level rise and embracing the issue with the waters. Will Travis said not only could that happen, that should happen for any low-lying areas, and he would endorse a project like that. And I don't want to get too into that, but if we're talking about doing something phenomenal, you know, and really having a regional impact and setting a standard for a real issue, sea level rise, this could be an opportunity. And Dave Pine, San Mateo County Board of Supervisor, agrees. And he's sitting on the commission for sea level rise for the Bay Area. Okay. I don't want to get too much into that, and I'm going to talk to this gentleman over here that does bioswales, because Will Travis said that we don't need more open bay waters, we need more wetlands. And this could accommodate both a footprint and bioremediation through bioswales and so on and so forth. One of the things that I'm also concerned with, I sat on the draft environmental impact report committee, which was a huge task, and I kept getting to the end of the chapters when they talked about mitigated measures, and they have a accommodation for any mitigated measures to be done when feasible. And those two words, when feasible, really resonated throughout the whole draft environmental impact report. And it kind of negates any obligation or responsibility to do anything. And so I want to know who's going to make it, or who's going to determine if it's feasible or not, and for so many various reasons as to why it wasn't feasible, it wasn't done. The last thing I'd like to share is that in our open space plan and in the general plan, they talk about 25% of the land is to be set aside for open space, and it used to say open space / open areas. Open space doesn't mean it has any habitat value, it just means it is public property, and open areas are private properties. Now there's wording, and you know, words make a difference when we're talking about legal rights to properties. Now it says open areas. It says open space and or open areas. So, I mean, what percentage is going to be open space and which percentage is going to be open areas? The fact that it says and or kind of leaves that really open for a lot of uncertainties. And so this has been a long process. I'm very, you know, I know UPC wants to bring some regional things to the properties, which would be huge. I wouldn't want to see a UC development come in for research and development, because then we're not governing them. They're governed by the state, and Brisbane wouldn't have any regulations to set for them. They just basically do what they want, so I wouldn't want to see any California institutions coming into the Baylands. I'm grateful that UPC is receptive to hiring union laborers, labor trades, or trades, I should say. That's good to know. That's going to really help us regionally and our economy and our businesses. You know, they're not bringing somebody in from Canada like other developers have done, and we've had to suffer their inadequacies and what they've cost this community. I'm mentioning that because of the people on the ridge that had to spend tons of money to take care of their properties because of negligence. But I'm grateful that we're at this point in this stage of our process, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. So did you want to address first, and then Commissioner Reinhardt and I can respond?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's only a few of Mr. Busquel's comments or questions I believe I'm qualified to answer, but I'll do my best. From back to front, the question of the open space or open area, I do think it's an important one. It's been raised many times, and it is important to consider one of the reasons why we have a combination of open space and open area is that publicly accessible, privately owned space needs to be funded for maintenance through private facilities. And the city of Brisbane, has some, I believe, some serious consideration as to how much public open space it wants to take responsibility for maintaining. So this is a question ongoing, whether you label it open space or open area. The primary question has to be what has to be included is how is it maintained and who pays for it. And this is a matter that we actually brought in some of the folks who manage open space for the Presidio of San Francisco and for the San Francisco parks during that process where I think it was Mr. Jim Dangerman was looking at some open space issues during the alternatives process, and they raised some important information about how open space is funded. And so we know that there are concerns about the quantification of area that would be publicly accessible and have for different uses. But I think that there's nothing about those numbers that are nefarious. They're simply labeled open space or open areas to look at different funding mechanisms for them. In terms of the question on mitigation measures when feasible and who determines this, I would leave that for staff to answer. When mitigation measures are set as conditions of approval, it's really the obligation of developers to follow them to the specifications set. And this gets back to some of the suggestions for that Mr. Buscal made about over excavation or mitigation on the cleanup of the rail yard soils that was above and beyond perhaps the capping requirements of the regulatory agencies. What my response to that would be, again, not as an engineer, but something along the lines that comment I made at your hearing on the remediation chapter of the EIR, is that we follow the standards that the regulatory agencies set. We don't set those standards, and so while there may be some ideas like this to be considered to go to vary from those requirements, I would invite Mr. Buscal during the public comment period for the remedial action plans that will apply to the rail yards to make those suggestions and have the regulatory agency take those into consideration. That would just be a suggestion. And I don't have any other answers to the comments that were made. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
So just in response to the speaker's question about floating wetlands, we actually looked into floating wetlands as part of a comprehensive restoration plan for the lagoon. We not only looked at floating wetlands as an opportunity, but also aquatic restoration, emergent wetland restoration, some of the lowland and upland restoration. We really looked at all those opportunities comprehensively. We had some of the similar conversations with the BCDC in terms of the regulatory framework around that, and really what the site was telling us, what the body of science around the Bay Area is that transition zone restoration I was talked about. And I did a poor job of articulating what the transition zone restoration is, but it's really that entire spectrum from aquatic ecology, into the emergent wetland, up into lowland and the beginning of the upland area, restoring that whole corridor as all of those different ecotones, not just restoring just the upland or just the wetlands. So it's that whole transition zone that we're looking at restoring, and one of the biggest opportunities on the property is, again, that northern edge of the lagoon. So we're trying to figure out which places would be best suited for that restoration, and that would be part of the development.
Wait. So you said that you had looked into the floating homes and
floating wetlands.
Not structures. They're not structures. Yeah.
Commissioner Parker, I believe, is raising a misunderstanding that you had the question. The question was
so the
regarding
floating structures that Paul Buscal is talking about is wetland restoration, or is it actually buildings? Because I'm getting confused.
So, because we don't have any real plans that are, things are being proposed, so is why I put that out there, but it was floating structures in amongst the habitat.
So you're talking about actual
It could
buildings
be,
or
if it was acceptable to the community, whether it was offices, homes, or whatever the plan put in there, it could be. The BCDC said that would be possible.
So are you talking about the same thing or something entirely different? That's why I'm confused.
Yeah, so sorry for clarification. Just talking about floating wetlands as part of a restoration activity.
Okay.
Not floating structures.
Paul wants to build the Venice here, city of Venice.
So would Commissioner Reinhardt like to start, or would you like me to start?
I'll go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So in order to address Mr. Pascal's very question about accountability, tonight for me it's about asking clarification questions of the applicant, as it was about the other two presentations meetings that we had prior to today. So much of what was asked tonight, in my opinion, was already addressed in the FEIR. And tonight was about an overview and a review of what has already been presented and has been in public record. So for the most part, what I saw was that the questions that were asked and were answered were included in things such as the specific plan and the infrastructure plan. In addition to that, as you see here, I have Chapter 4, the mitigation chart, which is really helpful to me. And I use that as a very organized way to check and double check the questions that I have multi-color coded. So for me, I didn't really have that many clarification questions, with the exception of possibly two. And one was addressed by Ms. Bice and Mr. Graff, which is about similarly situated situations and sites that would be at least 25 years or older, since we are phasing, according to the plan, about 25 years or so for the project. So that was asked and addressed, and the applicant has agreed to provide that data. The second issue for me was mostly about the economic fiscal feasibility of the plan. And I know that that's coming up and that's being worked on. The staff has addressed that multiple times in past conversations and at past meetings. In addition to that, Mr. Scharfman has reiterated that the applicant is also a part of that process and as moving forward. And Mr. Sweeky said that we would have that sometime, hopefully mid-January. So for me, again, those are two major issues, both of which were addressed tonight. So where I stand, I feel that I'm ready to move on to the deliberations, which is not tonight. So I promise that in deliberations you'll hear much more from me, my thoughts, my comments, and also that will incorporate where I stand in terms of certain things. But I tend not to make comments before that because I do want to respect my fellow commissioners. I do not want to dominate the conversation, given that I am in a position of chair. I take that very seriously, and I do want to respect others' time, especially the public who are here to access the experts. In fact, while we were on break, I was saying to some fellow commissioners that my intention was to re-invite the presentations or the presenters for each of the presentations to be available, so that when we do have deliberations, that if there are any additional follow-up questions or value-added questions, not commentary, not debate, but value-added questions for clarification purposes, that they be readily available for us to incorporate as part of our deliberation process. So, in addition to that, I was also thinking that it seems that many of the questions here, honestly, really reflect a need for greater input and accountability and use of the over multiple thousands of pages of the document that already does exist. So because of that, we tend to get, as someone mentioned earlier, it gets convoluted and we tend to forget. But I've been on the commission for 5 years, and this process has started for me for a long time. So this is coming to a culmination. So in answer to your question of why I spoke very little tonight, that's where I stand. Commissioner Ryan?
That's why I asked her to go first. Yeah, I mean, to add to that, it's, one of my goals here and my role is to hear from the citizens. And we've heard a lot. We've been through many of these hearings, and the majority of my issues are usually covered when the citizens come up and speak. And I really want to hear from the citizens because that's what this is all about. If there are issues that aren't addressed, I certainly will speak up. Adding Commissioner Anderson has been of great value because he's always very well prepared, and he actually covered two of my questions, so that was good. One of which was also the similar sites. I also did have an issue about noise mitigation, but I was waiting to see if that was going to be addressed again before I asked it, because, again, I just want to hear from the citizens first. And I guess on that note, we have such little participation in the Planning Commission, or had before this. So it's also a way to encourage, the citizens to come down, and when they come down, they're able to speak, and they have that time. So on that note, I'll just add my one question or clarification about the noise mitigation. Since it came up twice, I wasn't quite satisfied with the answer, but I was wondering in terms of pile driving, because it is a big concern, and especially the topography of Brisbane. If there's a concert in the park, there's a concert in my backyard. Noise travels very easily in this area. And what I was wondering is if there were, and I know that there are some alternatives to pile driving, and usually they cost more, but if in this case these alternatives were possible, with the owner, how would the owner deal with the cost of that? I think there are some really good alternatives to pile driving or methods that can be used that aren't as noisy and also good for these type of sites. So if you could address that, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And on the alternatives to pile driving, what I will say is that it is often looked at by soil engineers who set the foundation designs for buildings of an alternative in landfill areas to pre-drill the piles, so that there isn't the same type of driving or the frequency of driving, but it's also a mitigation for potential problems that the pile drivers have if they encounter, once they go through the legacy waste layer, some material that could be problematic, that the piles can't go through, and so that is I think Mr. Adair, when Mr. Adair was talking about some of those mitigations, they also come from experience. His firm has designed a lot of the mitigations out at Sierra Point, and I know that there have actually been some alternatives to pile driving out at Sierra Point that include pre-drilling. So that's one example. It is a different method. It is more expensive. Would likely be more difficult to justify on the rail yard side, but again, the sites that might need that would all be located primarily in the area around Geneva Avenue and to the north.
Thank you.
With that, does anybody else want to address the commission on the Baylands?
If you don't mind, I have 4 more questions that I would not like answered tonight. I would just like it put into the record for some future date. The issue of the cap came up several times, and I think one question we'd still like to hear the answer to is, how is the cap repaired if a repair is necessary? The answers were mostly about detecting whether repair was necessary. How is that actually done, like if there's a problem under a building? I was also wondering about the affordability of the R&D incubators. The buildings on Industrial Way look inexpensive, and the buildings in the drawings look expensive, so I'm wondering if that's going to be an issue for some people. Party responsible for cleanup. I understand that that passed to UPC when they purchased the area, since the landowner is typically responsible. So if we have a lot of individually owned housing, is the responsibility for cleanup going to be passed to a large number of individual owners? And finally, if an open area is a park that's privately owned and the maintenance is funded, can that go bankrupt, be closed, and be rebuilt with something else at a later date? And since it's 11:30, I think it would be great if those could be answered at another time.
Okay, I think.
Okay. So with that, can we make a motion to close the public hearing?
I make a motion to close the public hearing.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. So the commission decided earlier that we will proceed with the consent calendar and the remaining items at a later meeting. Can we make a motion for that?
Sure. I'll make a motion to move the
Remaining.
I'd like to make a motion to move the remaining items to a future commission meeting.
Are you just continuing to the next regular scheduled meeting? Is that what you're talking about doing?
Which is in January
December 24th?
That's postponed.
That's
January
or
14th.
January 14th.
January 14th.
To January 14th.
Online.
I think you'll be here by yourself on the 24th.
No, that would be crazy.
Christmas New Year.
I guess we'll do the memorandum at that point.
So to move to January 14th, our next scheduled meeting.
Yeah, I second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, okay. We have one remaining motion, that it would be to adjourn tonight's meeting, yeah?
Oh, I thought we just did.
No, we made a motion to move it.
To move and adjourn.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's adjourn.
Yeah, so.
Make a motion to adjourn.
I motion that our last motion was also a motion to adjourn.
I second that.
Now we're getting silly.
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
And I want to add one more thing. Happy New Year and happy
Thank you, everyone. Have a happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year.
It's not kosher to say.